In this lesson, we're going to walk through a simple PHP example that teaches us how conditional statements work. Conditional statements allow a program to make decisions based on different situations, and they're one of the most important building blocks in any programming language. In the code shown here, we start by creating a variable called num, and we assign it the value 10. A variable is just a container used to store information. In this case, the information we're storing is the number 10. Next, we use an if statement to check a condition. The condition we're testing is whether the number is less than or equal to 0. In simple words, the program is asking, is this number negative or is it 0? If this condition is true, then the code inside the first block will run, and the program will display the message, the number is negative. However, in this example, the number is 10, which is not less than or equal to 0. That means the condition in the if statement is false. Because of that, the program skips the first block and moves to the else statement. The else block runs automatically whenever the condition inside the if statement is not met. Inside the else block, we have a simple command that prints the number is positive. Since our number is indeed positive, that is exactly the message we see as the output. This small example shows how PHP can make logical decisions. By checking conditions and choosing different actions, your program becomes interactive and intelligent. Understanding if-else statements is the first step toward writing more advanced logic in your applications.
Now that we've seen a real example of an if-else statement in PHP, let's take a moment to understand the general structure, or the syntax of how an if-else statement works in programming. The syntax basically tells us the correct way to write the statement so the computer can understand and execute it properly. An if-else statement is made up of two main parts. The first part is the if block, which contains a condition. A condition is simply a question the computer checks, something that can only be true or false. The structure starts with the keyword if, followed by the condition written inside parentheses. When the condition inside the parentheses is true, the code inside the curly braces immediately after the if statement will run. This is where you place the instructions you want to execute when the condition is met. But what happens if the condition is not true? That's where the else block comes in. The else block is optional, but incredibly useful. It runs only when the condition in the if statement is false. Just like the if block, the else block also uses curly braces to contain the code that should run in that situation. So, to summarize the flow, if the condition is true, the code inside the if block runs. If the condition is false, the code inside the else block runs instead. This structure is the foundation of decision-making in programming. Whether you're checking a number, verifying user input, or controlling how your program behaves, the if-else statement gives your code the power to choose different paths based on different situations. As you continue learning PHP and other programming languages, this simple concept will become one of the most essential tools you use.
Let's continue our learning of the if-else statement with another clear example. In Code Snippet 4, we take a real-life situation and show how a program can make decisions based on the time of day. This example helps beginners understand how conditional logic can be used to create interactive and dynamic messages. In this code, we first stored the current hour of the day inside a variable called hour of day. The date.h function in PHP returns the current hour in 24-hour format, which means the value can be anywhere from 00 to 23. For example, if the time right now is 7 p.m., the function will return 19. This gives our program the ability to know what time it is. Next, we use the if statement to check whether the hour is less than 18. Since 18 represents 6 p.m. in 24-hour time, we're basically asking, is it before 6 p.m.? If the answer is yes, meaning the condition is true, the program will display the message, "Have a nice day ahead." This message is suitable for morning and afternoon hours. But if the hour is not less than 18, that means it is 6 p.m. or later. In that case, the condition becomes false, and the program automatically moves to the else block. Inside the else block, we display the message, "Good night." This makes sense because after 6 p.m., people generally start winding down their day.
In the output shown, the message printed is "Good night," which tells us that the current hour was 18 or greater when the code ran. This example nicely demonstrates how programs can behave differently depending on real-world data, such as the current time. By understanding this, you can start creating smarter and more personalized applications.
Now that we fully understand the basic if-else structure, let's move one step further and explore a slightly more advanced version called the if, elseif, else statement. This form is used when we need to check multiple conditions, not just one or two. In real programming, situations often involve more than a simple yes or no decision. That's where if, elseif, else becomes incredibly useful. The idea is simple. First, the program checks the condition inside the if statement. If that condition is true, it executes the code inside that block and skips everything else. But if the first condition is false, the program doesn't stop. Instead, it moves on to the else if statement, where another condition is checked. You can think of else if as a second question the program asks. If this second condition is true, its block of code is executed. And finally, if none of the conditions in the if or any else if statements are true, the program executes the code inside the else block. The else block is always the final fallback. To understand this better, imagine a flowchart that checks whether a number is negative, even, or odd. Let's say the number stored in the variable is 13. First, the program checks if the number is less than 0. Since 13 is not negative, that condition is false and the program continues to the next check. The next condition tests whether the number is even by checking if num%2 is equal to 0. The symbol percent is the modulus operator, which returns the remainder after division. If a number divided by 2 leaves a remainder of 0, it is even. But since 13 leaves a remainder of 1, this condition is also false. Because both previous checks failed, the program finally reaches the else block and correctly prints the number is odd. This example demonstrates how if-elseif else lets your program make more complex decisions by evaluating several possibilities in order. It's a key concept in building smart, flexible, and dynamic applications. The next code snippet will show exactly how this looks when written in PHP.
Now, let's look at the flowchart and code snippet 5 to understand exactly how the if, elseif, else structure works step by step. Flowcharts are extremely helpful for beginners because they visually show the path a program takes when making decisions. So let's walk through it slowly and clearly. The flowchart begins with a simple start point, and then we assign a value to our variable. In this example, the variable num is given the value 13. This value will be evaluated through a series of conditions. The first decision the program makes is shown in the diamond-shaped box labeled num less than 0 ? This means the program is asking, is the number less than 0? If the answer is yes, meaning the condition is true, the program immediately goes to the block that prints the number is negative. But since 13 is not less than 0, this condition is false, so the program follows the path to the next decision point. The second diamond checks another condition, num%2 equals 0. This condition determines whether the number is even. The percent symbol, also known as the modulus operator, gives us the remainder when a number is divided. If a number divided by 2 leaves no remainder, then it is even. But when we divide 13 by 2, the remainder is 1. Because of that, this condition is also false. Since both previous conditions were false, the program now moves into the final else block. That is why the flowchart shows the arrow leading to the block labeled "the number is odd." That is the correct result for our value of 13. On the right side, you can see the PHP code for this logic in code snippet 5. It begins by checking if the number is negative, then checks if the number is even, and finally, if both conditions fail, it prints that the number is odd. This code mirrors the exact steps shown in the flowchart. The important lesson here is that the program evaluates each condition in order. The moment it finds a true condition, it stops checking the rest. If none of the conditions are true, the else block handles the remaining cases. This structure allows us to handle multiple possibilities in a clean and organized way.
Now let's take a closer look at code snippet 5, which perfectly demonstrates how the if, elseif, else statement works in a real PHP program. This example is simple, but it clearly shows how a program handles multiple conditions one after another until it finds the correct match. In this snippet, we begin by assigning the value 13 to the variable num. This is the number our program will analyze. Once the number is set, the program enters the first condition inside the if statement. Here, it checks whether the number is less than 0. In other words, it asks, is this number negative? Since 13 is greater than 0, this condition becomes false. Because it's false, the program skips the block inside the if statement and moves forward. Next, the program reaches the else if condition. This one checks whether the number is even by using the expression num%2 = 0. Remember, the modulus operator % returns the remainder of a division. A number is even only if dividing it by 2 leaves no remainder. But when we divide 13 by 2, the remainder is 1. This means the condition is false again, so the program continues to the next block. Finally, since neither the if nor the else if conditions were true, the program arrives at the else block. The else block doesn't need a condition because it only runs when all previous conditions have failed. In this case, that's exactly what happens. So the program executes the line inside the else block and prints the number is odd. The output shown confirms this result. Because 13 is neither negative nor even, the correct classification is odd, and that's the message that gets displayed. This simple example clearly demonstrates how if, elseif, else statements allow a program to choose the correct outcome from several possibilities simply by checking each condition in order.
Now that we have seen how the if, elseif, else statement works through examples and a flowchart, let's take a moment to understand its general syntax. The syntax tells us the exact structure we must follow so the program can correctly evaluate multiple conditions in order. The if, elseif, else structure always begins with the if statement. Inside the parentheses, we place the first condition. If this condition is true, the block of code inside the curly braces immediately runs, and the program does not check any further conditions. This is the first decision point, and it handles the most important or most likely case. If the first condition is false, the program moves on to the elseif statement. The keyword elseif stands for else if, and it is used to test an additional condition. The elseif block only runs when the first condition is false and the elseif condition is true. You can also have multiple elseif statements if your program needs to check many different possibilities. Finally, the structure ends with the else block. The else part does not require a condition because it acts as the final catch-all option. The code inside the else block runs only when all previous conditions, both if and any else if statements, have evaluated to false. This ensures that no matter what value we are testing, the program always has a path to follow. This syntax gives us a clean and organized way to handle situations where several outcomes are possible. By checking conditions in sequence, the program can choose the correct block of code to execute, making your logic easier to follow and much more powerful.
Now, let's move on to code snippet 6, which gives us a more practical and real-life example of the if, elseif, else statement in action. This code uses the current hour from the server to decide which greeting message to display. This is a great example because it shows how conditional statements can make your web pages feel dynamic and responsive to real-world data. The program begins by storing the current hour in the variable $t, using the function date within the parentheses H. This function returns the hour in 24-hour format, from 00 to 23.
So, for example, if the server time is 15, that means it's 3 p.m. After capturing that hour, the code prints a simple 9 showing what the current hour is. Next, the program enters the if, elseif, else decision structure. The first condition checks whether the hour is less than 12. If this is true, it means the time is between midnight and 11:59 a.m., so the program displays happy morning. This handles all morning hours. If the first condition is false, meaning the hour is 12 or later, the program moves to the else if condition. Here it checks whether the hour is less than 20. If this condition is true, it means the time is between noon and 7:59 p.m. In that case, the program prints nice day. This covers the entire afternoon and early evening. Finally, if neither of the previous conditions is true, the program reaches the else block. This block handles all remaining hours, which means the time must be between 8 p.m. and midnight. For these late night hours, the program prints good night. In the example shown, the server hour is 15, which is 3 p.m. That means the first condition is false, but the second condition is true. As a result, the program displays the message, nice day. This makes perfect sense for an afternoon time like this. This example demonstrates how multiple conditions help your code choose the correct output depending on the current situation. It also shows how easy it is to make your PHP programs dynamic and time-aware using simple conditional logic.
Now that we've explored the if, elseif, and else statements in detail, let's move to another powerful decision-making tool in PHP called the switch statement. The switch statement is often used as an alternative to multiple elseif conditions, especially when you want to compare one value against several possible choices in a cleaner and more organized way. The idea behind the switch statement is very simple. Instead of writing several elseif conditions to check the same variable again and again, the switch structure allows you to check that variable once and then match it against different predefined cases. This not only makes your code easier to read, but also makes it more efficient when you have many possible outcomes. The switch statement starts with the keyword switch, followed by the value or variable you want to test inside parentheses. Inside the curly braces, you define several case labels. Each case represents a possible value the variable might have. For example, if the variable equals label1, the code inside the label1 case will run. After executing that block, we usually add the keyword break to prevent the program from continuing into the next case by accident. If none of the cases match the value being tested, the switch statement falls back to the default block. This works similarly to the if-else block in an if-else structure, and it handles all situations that don't match any specific case. So in simple words, if checks one condition, else if checks additional conditions, switch checks one variable against multiple fixed options in a clean and structured way. The switch statement is especially useful when you are dealing with menus, modes, categories, or any situation where a single value can belong to several clearly defined groups. In our next part, we'll look at a practical example of the switch statement in PHP so you can see how it works in action.
Now that we've been introduced to the switch statement, let's take a moment to understand how it actually works behind the scenes. This will give you a clearer idea of why switch statements are so useful and when you should prefer them over long chains of if-else-if conditions. In the first step, the switch statement evaluates the expression, usually a variable, only once. This is an important difference compared to the if-else-if structure, where each condition has to be checked individually. In the switch statement, the value of the expression is compared against several predefined case labels. If the value matches one of the case labels, the code block belonging to that case is executed. For example, if the variable equals label2, then the program jumps directly to the code under case label2 and runs that block. This makes the flow very straightforward and easy to follow. One important feature of the switch structure is the break keyword. The break statement stops the program from accidentally executing the next case as well. Without break, the program would continue into the next case block even if the correct match was already found. This behavior is called fall through, and most of the time we want to avoid it. That's why adding break at the end of each case is considered good practice. Finally, if none of the case labels match the value of the expression, the program executes the default block. This works the same way as the else section in an if-else structure. The default block ensures that the program always has a response even if the value doesn't match any specific case. So, in simple terms, the expression is evaluated once. It is compared with all case labels. When a match is found, the corresponding code block runs. The break statement prevents accidental fall-through. And if no match is found, the default case handles the situation. This makes the switch statement a clean, efficient, and beginner-friendly way to write decision-making code when a single value needs to be checked against several possibilities.
Now let's take a detailed look at code snippet 7, which clearly demonstrates how the switch statement behaves when comparing a variable against several possible values. This example uses a simple scenario where we want to display a message based on someone's favorite programming language. In this code, the variable language is assigned the value PHP 8. This is the value that the switch statement will evaluate. Once the switch begins, PHP checks the value of the variable and compares it with each case label one by one. The first case checks whether the value is C. Since our variable contains PHP 8, this condition does not match. Because of that, the program skips the code block under this case and moves to the next one. The second case checks whether the value matches PHP 8, and this time it does. Since the variable value and the case label are exactly the same, the program executes the code inside this case and prints, "Your favorite language is PHP 8." Immediately after printing this message, the break statement stops the switch from continuing to the following cases. This is important because without break, the program would fall through and execute other cases as well, which is usually not what we want. The remaining cases, including C++ and the default section, are not executed because the correct match has already been found. The default section would only run if none of the case labels matched the value of the variable. One thing worth noting is that in this example, the value for language is hard-coded directly inside the program. But in real-world applications, this value often comes from user input, such as a form, a drop-down list, or a database, that makes switch statements even more useful for handling multiple user choices cleanly and efficiently. So the output of this snippet is exactly what we expect. Your favorite language is PHP 8. This example perfectly demonstrates how the switch statement helps simplify code when checking a single variable against multiple distinct possibilities.